Welcome all again. The topic of our panel is ideas of Hong Kong's freedom movement. First, I would like to our guests to introduce themselves briefly, and also for Marcin to say his views about Hong Kong and maybe even in general how libertarians view Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you for briefly introduction. Yes, that's true. My name is Marcin, and my last name is Chmielowski. Honestly, I'm not an expert in China culture or Chinese politics or Hong Kong politics, but yes, I am a political scientist and a philosopher of politics, maybe. And just like Adam said, I'm also a libertarian. Unfortunately, most of libertarians will always tell by themselves that yes, we are libertarians. Hey, that's us. We are the minority, right? But Adam done it before me. But yes, I'm a libertarian too. So my brief feelings and ideas after watching this movie. First of all, it's very informative. I've learned a lot of. That's the first thing. Second is. I think that the definition of localism is somewhat different here in Europe and there in Hong Kong. Here in Europe, for most of the time, I'm not saying that always, because there's no such a thing like always in social sciences. But for most of the time here in Europe, we see localism as a kind of rather right-wing approach. And what we can see in the example of Hong Kong is more something like, in Europe we call it civic nationalism, which have nothing to do with nationalism per se, but it's more like a keeping tight to rather liberal and political traditions. And I think that this can be a kind of correspondence between Hong Kong way of thinking with the former British one, maybe. Just as I said, I'm not an expert here, but definitely this kind of localism had a lot to do with libertarianism. Definitely. Well, first of all, well, like it or not, but Hong Kong is maybe even still one of the rather free places in the world if we are talking about economics. And few years ago, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was also rather free or very free also in the sense of politics. Now it changed, and this is why we was watching this movie. And so libertarians are very strongly for free trade, free markets, capitalism, yeah, and Hong Kong is a very capitalistic place. So that's the first thing. But second is, there is no libertarianism that is based only on free market. It doesn't work like that. You need to have, civic freedoms, lots of political freedoms too. And people must be independent. And in a situation when very I would say politically exposing and let's say it short, totalitarian regime from Beijing is trying to rip off from this Hong Kong people from the freedoms. We cannot say nothing that hey, Hong Kong is still a kind of somewhat libertarian place, but there is a difference between idea and what we have now. Unfortunately, now Hong Kong isn't a free place, but maybe in the future it will be because of this specific, very specific, from my European point of view, very specific way of thinking about localism, which, yes, have lots to do with what we know as libertarian idea. Thank you.
Ray, can you introduce yourself briefly? And we would like to hear your comments about the movie. And also, I would like to ask you what happened to you and to Edward after the movie ended, and what happened to localist movement also.
What's the last question?
What happened to you and Edward and localist movement after the timeline of the movie ended?
Yeah, as I have already introduced myself and you learned about me in the documentary, I'm Wong. I'm now a political asylum in Germany. I agreed with Marcin. You said you are no expert in China and Hong Kong, but I could say you really have a very sharp sense in understanding the political situation and localism in Hong Kong. You just mentioned the difference between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Actually, the Hong Kong localism is exactly based on the idea of civic nationalism. One of the most important books that inspires the Hong Kong localism is the book written by political scientist Benedict Anderson, The Imagined Community, in which he distinguished these two different kind of nationalisms. And what localism is really against and what we really protect is first we against the Chinese official nationalism, which is the kind of nationalism that provoked all the disaster back in the beginning and the mid of 20th century in Europe, and not only in Europe, all over the world. And what we are protecting is exactly the foundations you said for the free market is those civic rights, civic freedom, individual freedoms. And you also mentioned it that is a very important point. To understand any kind of ism, we have to put the ism into the context. Like localism always has a negative connotation in Europe, also in North America. And so when I told European that in Hong Kong I was localist, they already label me as a right wing, as an extremist, I'm a fascist, I am very exclusive. But no. We have to understand the context in Hong Kong because Hong Kongers are the victims of the suppressive politics from Beijing, from the external regime. And why we emphasize the uniqueness of our identity is to protect our civic values. That's the core of Hong Kong localism. And going back to your question, how is Edward doing and me? Edward was released the beginning of this year, but I still couldn't get in touch with him because he is under the surveillance of the Hong Kong security apparatus. The chef of the security department said that for this kind of influential politicians, influential activists, the Hong Kong government and the police will always keep an eye on them. So as I am one of the wanted persons under the national security law, anyone who has been in touch with me would be seen as a violator of the national security law. So I even couldn't get in touch with my family because I think many of you know that during the Chinese New Year, family member would give red pocket money to their children, to their junior. But if anyone in my family gives me money, they would be charged with collusion with Malay foreign forces because, they believe I'm a separatist threatening the Chinese national security. And that's the reality for me and Edward.
And what happened to the Hong Kong localist or independence movement in Hong Kong after 2020 national security law and internationally?
I think I would say it's a self-fulfilling prophet because the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party imposed the national security law in Hong Kong is to prevent the spread of separatism, to prevent the spread of Hong Kong independence movement. But ironically, a day before the implementation of the national security law, everyone on the street was chanting Hong Kong independence, the only way out. But of course, after the implementation, just even the slogans, liberate Hong Kong, the revolutions of our time, is deemed to be a violation of the law. So people now are not chanting. But I believe the idea of Hong Kong independence has already rooted into the mentality of Hong Kong people, because that's a very logical conclusion. So first, we have tried one country, two systems. We believe that as long as we don't really pose a threat to the stability in China, the Chinese government would allow Hong Kong people to enjoy certain degrees of autonomy. But no, even if we are not going to do anything in China, China is gradually, secretly infiltrating our society, wanted to undermine the fundamental values of Hong Kong. So one country, two systems doesn't work. Then what else could we do? Is it possible to have democracy under the communist regime? No. Then the only way out is to get rid of the communist regime. Then how? Well, independence. So I believe all the Hong Kongers who really paid a bit effort to think about the future of Hong Kong and who truly understand the condition now in Hong Kong would come to the same conclusions. In our diasporic community, we have mixed opinions. Some people believe that advocating for Hong Kong independence is not strategically smart, because politicians from other countries would not support it. Like we could see the German government in the topic of Taiwan also insists that they are sticking to the one China policy. And if someone like me who advocates Hong Kong independence get close to them, China will definitely have a severe response. That's why some people believe that's not a smart way. But at the same time, especially young people think, well, Hong Kong people have our own agency. We shouldn't behave in a way that the world expects us to behave. So whoever supports Hong Kong independence should say it out loud. I'm somewhat in between, because on the one hand, I have to continue my advocacy work, and I also understand that if I explicitly advocate for Hong Kong independence, it may not really help my cause, but I think everyone who knows me publicly or personally knows what is my ultimate goal.
Marcin, do you want to respond to Roy?
Of course, the situation is absolutely unique that Hong Kongers are now in, but there are some similarities between what you can do and what Poles in 19th century could do, or at least tried to do. Because yes, during 19th century we also were stripped of our independence, and also there were two ways of what we can do and what we should do. And mostly in Kraków, and back then also Lwów was a Polish city, we had a kind of way of thinking that yes, we can work in a more moderate way. So yes, maybe we shouldn't speak out loud about regaining independence, maybe we should cooperate. So that was the first idea. But the second was that no, we will be fighting till the bitter end, and this is why we had uprisings. None of them actually worked, so that's the next thing. I'm talking about at least two general ones, which is January uprising and well, by the way, second one. But at least now we don't know which tactics will be efficient. We just don't know it. So the only advice is that you should do both of them at the same time. But the most important thing is being visible. I know that at least now in Poland and actually in whole Europe, the most important topic is Ukraine, and it would be strange if I would say that hey, this is something unusual. Yes, it is usual that we should speak out loud that Russia attacked Ukraine and that's it. But this is why number one is not a Hong Kong cause. It's something different. And your role, which you are doing great, is to push the topic, push the agenda. Because who knows what will happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, we don't know that. But there will be a time when some changes on the political map too will be possible. And your agenda need to be known to the people who will be making decisions.
Right. We have some Taiwanese on the audience. So the digital minister of Taiwan is gradually transforming the Taiwanese state government into a more voluntary one, as libertarians would like to see. And I have a brief question for you, Marcin. What are your recommendations for Hong Kongers after achieving independence?
I think that what we are talking about, this rather nice strategy from Taiwan, can be seen also in Europe. In Europe, we have a small country, Estonia. They are unable to protect themselves against Russia because there's only about 1 million of Estonians, and Russian is 144 times more, right? So what was the Estonian idea? To make a digital citizenship, at least for companies. This is how they will be able to put a lots of interest into this small country. And yes, I think that Taiwan is doing the same, but what should Hong Kongers do after regaining independence? Well, learn from history, because your own government can be also very rude and nasty, and maybe even as nasty our government in Beijing. This is, of course, a typical libertarian solution, so please be prepared that every government can be nasty from time to time, and you need always to watch hands of all politicians. This is why we are citizens, right? We should do it. Without that, we will lose our independence, our personal freedoms, and so on. So this is the only thing that I can say now, because when it happened, well, the context can be much different than from nowadays. So this is why only thing that I can give is a very, very general advice to just learn history, learn from Hong Kong's history, that governments can be nasty, but every government can be nasty, at least from time to time.
Thank you. Ray, how do you view the future of Hong Kong independence movement and Hong Kong as a city?
I think no one really has a crystal ball to say what is going to happen in the future, but we could make some prognosis based on the current trend. So what is the trend now? Hong Kong as a city is fully under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Also, because of the national security law, rooms for any resistance movement is very limited. That's why it's important for Hong Konger overseas to take up the responsibility to develop our nation, to enrich our culture, and to lobby Western government. In the long term, I think time is on our side, because after the 2019 movement, a lot of Western countries have finally woken up, and they finally realized that the Chinese Communist Party and China in general is not heading towards the directions that they expected many, many years ago. Back in the 90s and after the fall of Soviet Union, the West generally was too naive to believe that China is opening up by more engagement, more trade relationship with China. China will eventually become a democratic, free society. But the protests in Hong Kong, the suppression on the people of Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, on Tibet, and also the threat to Taiwanese people show very clearly that Chinese Communist Party is not going to change, because this is their essence. And because of this structure, the Chinese Communist Party will always have another authoritarian leader like Xi Jinping. So if the West change its approach to China, I believe in a long run, what happened to Soviet Union could also happen to China. Now, why it's all the resistance movements in China, in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet is so difficult? There are two key factors. The first one is the resources the Chinese government has to invest on its surveillance system. The second one is technology that they have to develop also, the surveillance system. If they don't have the money they got from the free world, like they are earning tons of money in Europe, in America, in the rest of the world, if they don't have that money, they don't have the resources to sustain this huge state security apparatus. This is the first point. The second point is Western technology. Like Siemens, the German company, has given a lot of technology related to facial recognition to the Chinese government. So the Chinese government used this technology to develop social credit system and also the surveillance systems to monitor their re-education camp and implement it in the whole Xinjiang. If the Chinese couldn't get Western technology and couldn't earn money from the West, I believe eventually the society will be, the government will be weakened, and there will be cracks in the society. And that's the moment when the people of China could rise up, could finally demand for regime change. So in the long term, I am quite optimistic.
Thank you, gentlemen. We are beginning our Q&A session. If you have a question, raise your hand and someone from our team will give you a microphone. And please, when asking a question, specify if it's for Marcin, Ray, or both.
I have one question, like with an extension to Ray, and one question in regards to libertarianism to Martin. Ray, the thing is with the Hong Kong localism, with the whole movement, and how some of the CCP supporters and how some of the people are trying to frame it as a right-wing movement and so on. Did you try to explore, or, because I have seen some of the posters during the protests that people are writing, colonizers go away. They're talking about the Chinese colonizers in that case, because is there an attempt, or are there people in Hong Kong or Hong Kongers abroad? Are you talking about things like, are you talking about Hong Kong in frames of post-colonial studies? Because right now in Europe, in the United States, post-colonial studies and post-colonial justice is being always discussed in academia. And Hong Kong being a place that has been occupied by, first by the United Kingdom, later on, it's the new occupation by China, because the CCP government, they had no rights to own Hong Kong. They have, because Hong Kong used to belong to Qin Empire before the government, which is not related to the communist government, to the communist authorities of China, and there was no referendum in Hong Kong. People were not asked if they want to join China. That's why when I'm talking about Hong Kong, I avoid using the word reunification, because it's not reunification. You cannot be reunified with some place that you have never owned, right? And that thing is there like a talk in Hong Kong academia or amongst Hong Kong activists in regards to the post-colonial justice and post-colonial studies in Hong Kong? And question to Martin, Marcin, is related. Yeah.
No, just let him ask first and then we respond.
Because I'm also interested in libertarianism and Chicago School of Economics. I love Milton Friedman work. And if we're talking about the state building, which the process that will be, that people in Hong Kong will face sooner or later once they get their independence, if we're talking about the libertarian thought, the limited government, individual freedom, above it all, what are the relations, in your opinion, between the government, which is limited, and such an institution as army, which sometimes does interfere with the individual freedoms and rights, especially if people have to encounter draft. And in terms of Hong Kong, the biggest difference between Hong Kong and Taiwan is that Hong Kong didn't have their own army. The PLA is in Hong Kong, but Taiwan has their own army. And as a libertarian, can you give your perspective on that thing? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your wonderful questions. I would like to first share my feelings on the post-colonialism discussions here in Europe first. My sense is that the whole post-colonialism discussion is a bit Eurocentric, because for academia in this particular fields, they always look into European colonialism. But how about Russia? I also read a lot of articles from Ukrainian scholar saying in the whole post-colonialism discussions, Russia is not even a colonizer, or in a very mild way. And so if they don't even recognize Russia as a colonizer, how would they believe that China could also become a colonizer? And in Western academia, how, especially in Germany, how they understand China, or the emergence of modern China is still very much focusing on the events in the early and mid-19th century. China was being bullied by the whole West, and so the West is the only evil in the world through history. That's a bit of my sense. Of course, it's a bit generalizations, but yeah. So I personally also don't think that that's the only framework for Hong Kong to understand our own relations with China. For me, yes, Hong Kong has never been decolonized. We are just changing our colonizer from the breed to China. And if you really ask my honest opinion, the British colonial administration actually was better than the current colonial administration. And it's also true that for a lot of Hong Kong people, they did believe Hong Kong belonged to China, and it has a lot of historical background and also granted on their subjective interpretations of the history of Hong Kong. So it's a very complicated topic, and there is no consensus as to whether the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement should understand the relations between Hong Kong and China in the framework of post-colonialism.
Thank you for your question. So my observation is that as libertarians, our movement is always much stronger in theory of economics than in political science. And I think that my generation and maybe next generations of libertarians should define these holes and try to propose a serious and also reliable and practical way of living in the world, how it is, but and not how it should be. So that's the difference. So that's the general statement. Second thing is, well, I am definitely against the draft. I'm definitely against the draft, but at the same time, I am quite close to what objectivists and Ayn Rand in general said, which is that yes, we need an army because unfortunately our enemies can have an armies too. So this is why we need to have them. And yes, well, as a libertarian, I'm very personally. I just don't like our own Polish government, especially now. But what they are doing, that trying to modernize our army, is something smart, and every government should do it, especially if you have a border with Russia. And what should it look like in Hong Kong in the future? For so small terrain, maybe such systems like Swiss will be effective. I know that there is a kind of a draft in Switzerland. Yeah, I got it, but it will be their decision. Also, I can imagine a situation where there is a formally draft, but about 99% of the people just want to be drafted. They want to be drafters. It is possible. It's about public morale, right? So maybe it will be good for them. But I think that armies in the future, sometimes at least, won't have a need to be very, very big. Technology will be, or it is already, much more important. And of course, we have an example, which is Ukraine.
We have time for one more short question, if someone has, please.
Okay, hello, Mr. Ray and Mr. Marcin. This is a question for you. Yeah, Mr. Ray, we have just met. I was in sunglasses. So it's nice to meet you today. So I'm from China. So as a Chinese perspective, as you can know that the A4 white paper revolution is starting in China. So this question is for Mr. Ray. That do you think you could have some suggestions for the Chinese who are doing this A4 white paper revolution? And for Mr. Marcin, that because for China and Poland, we both have the communist time, and also in Poland, solidarity in Gdansk succeeded. So do you also have any some suggestions to Chinese to succeed, like what you did in solidarity in Gdansk? Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. To be honest, if you ask me whether I think the A4 blank paper revolution would succeed, no. I would say that's the beginning of a successful movement. Chinese people have been apolitical since 1989 because the deal between the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese people was that as long as the people don't oppose the government, the Communist Party will secure your wealth, secure your security. But since Xi Jinping comes to power, everything has changed. But still, as I said, the surveillance system is very extensive, very mature. The state security apparatus is now still very powerful. I don't see any cracks in the whole societal system. In Hong Kong, if we study the case in Hong Kong, maybe Mr. Marcin could share more about the examples in Poland. In Hong Kong, we still, in 2019, we had freedom of expression. So people could discuss what is going on now, and they could clarify where we are at that time. So they could plan for the next move. But in China, there is no freedom of expression and no freedom of information. I believe people who live in some second-tier or third-tier city, they probably don't know much about the protests happening in all the big cities. So that's the first thing I think the Chinese pro-democracy movement has to overcome. The second point is the ability, the capacity to organize, to mobilize people. You have a great firewall on the internet. In the case of Hong Kong, we have Telegram, we have online forum. People could discuss, okay, tomorrow what time we will meet where. But in China, that's next to impossible. So, but I'm still optimistic, and as I said, I think this is the beginning of a successful movement. Why? Because I'm seeing a lot of Chinese students overseas like you, politically awakening. Just a few days ago, I attended fusions organized by Chinese students in Göttingen, and I asked them whether it's their first time to join any kind of political event. They all told me yes, it's their first time, and they all confessed to me that I'm sorry, we didn't support you back in 2019. At that time, we were still very much indoctrinated by the CCP ideology. But after these 3 years, they finally woke up. They finally realized that the deal with the Chinese Communist Party is not a smart one at all. They finally realized freedom and human dignities are way more important than the so-called material interests provided by the party. And I believe as long as the Chinese student overseas continues to develop a vibrant civil society for the pro-democracy movement in China, I have great hope.
Really, really short, because we already ran out of time. The answer was in the movie, and the solidarity was the same. Solidarity was successful because that was a grassroots movement. This is why. So we had many local leaders. So that was very important thing. And these people were helping each other and they were care about each other. And in the movie you could see there were words that people are interested in being mutual friends. And I think that this is not maybe not the only way, but to overcome this terrible situation. But I think that this is a kind of level one to do something more. But you need to have, at the beginning, you need to have a table to put something on it. And yes, grassroots movements is a kind of a table.
Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you to our guests, especially to Ray for coming from Germany here. Thank you all for coming here, and we for Hong Kong, we invite you to our next screening at next Saturday in Kinoteca for the Love in the Time of Revolution.
Few words. I would also like to know your feedback on the movie or the whole panel in general. So I will be standing outside. So if you have any feedback that you would like to tell me, share to me, please feel free to come to me. Thank you very much.
Maybe we'll end with your friend's favorite slogan, Wong for Hong Kong.
時代革命. Yes, thank you.